Hello, my name is Marcel de Jong. I'm a technical specialist in North America, and the demo I'll be showing here is an Arnold rendering overview in Maya, covering all the basic concepts that you deal with in Arnold. So Arnold was added in Maya 2017, and since then we've also released Arnold 5. So some of the things that I'll be showing in the demo are specifically related to Arnold 5, and then some of it is more general Arnold. The content I'll be using is the Dreadnoughts content, which is what we've been using for some time now on a number of demos. And so this is just to kind of add to that list of demos and have it all be part of the same set of content. With that, the idea of Dreadnoughts is essentially an air race that's set in the future using previously used vehicles by the military that have been found in the desert, retrofit by racing crews, and then entered into this race. And this is one of the racers. So the graphics configuration here that you see is the original prototype before it even entered military service, and then later on these get decked out with elaborate graphics. So the first thing is that I'll show some of the versions that we have. So this particular vehicle has to the body has about I think it's 10 shaders assigned to it. Each of them assigned to a set of faces. So each shader is just kind of covering a portion of the surface, and several of these shaders have textures associated with them that I can swap out for different versions of jets. So the first thing I'll do here is render this and show you that we can remap these texture sets to different vehicles by just referencing different folders. We can select the file path editor, and the folder here that's relevant is the one called Jet Textures, and inside of it you'll find 4 folders with textures that have the exact same naming. So if I were to go in and remap this, I'm going to make sure that both the search in subfolders and the repath currently resolved files are turned on. And in here I can select the red racer, for example, and you'll see that as soon as I repath that, it'll start rendering the next version. So that's one of the jets. You can see that I have some graphics on there that are essentially geometry, which I'm going to turn off. I'm going to take that out. That was really just associated with the prototype. So let's go ahead and select that same folder and then maybe repath this to show you another one, which would be the green racer. There it is, and let's go ahead and repath that. So you can see what that looks like. It's got some big numbers on it. It's got some logos and some graphics, some detailed graphics on it that are different from the red racer as well as the prototype. Next one, our last one, is the Euro version. It's a European version of the racer that I included. One of the other things that we can do, or that I'd like to mention here, is the .tx format. So in this case, if we look at any of these folders, you can see that you have a list of textures or TIFFs, which are the original textures created, and then identically named versions of the textures, but as .tx formats. So the .tx format is not really unlike .exr or .tiff, but it does have some extra attributes. It includes a fingerprint, if you will. It can see what's inside the file. If it sees the same content in this file, it only loads it once. The other thing that's really useful about this is that .tx is both mid-map. So even at very low AA sample rates, you still get pretty decent quality textures, as well as tiled. In other words, and by default the tile size is 64 by 64. So your textures are loaded into memory as tiles, so it only loads what it needs to render what you see. What you don't see is not loaded, which makes it memory efficient. So those are some of the difference between .tx and then .tiff and .exr. The fact that you only load tiles is not something you can do with a JPEG, for example, so it's super useful and optimized. One more thing before I move on is the TX Manager. So this is introduced in Arnold 5, where you can batch convert textures inside of a folder. So if you load a folder, for example, and you don't have .tx files yet, you can have it also search in subfolders, and you can create the .tx textures from whatever's inside of that folder. Otherwise, the conversion happens at render time. When you go into rendering, you'll see that under Arnold rendering, there's something called textures, and under textures, there's auto convert to TX. Let's just go ahead and turn this off for now, and I'm going to turn off the ground plane and turn on this industrial looking pad that looks a little more interesting. And we can also select this set over here, right click, say select set members, and then right click, go to new material, and under shader we'll select surface and add this AI standard surface shader. So this AI standard surface shader is a new shader replacing the AI standard shader from Arnold 4. And with that, I can start to access either presets, and the ones above the lines here, the double lines, are presets that ship with the software. The other ones that I've created just to kind of give myself some options to quickly get to a certain look if I want to. So with that, let's just talk a little bit about this particular shader. There's a base category, a specular category, a transmission or transparency / refraction category, a subsurface category to simulate skin, a coat category to have a secondary specular to create things like car paint, for example, an emissive category to have it actually give it the appearance of emitting light. Let's actually render this. I'll start to manipulate things like, color. You can see that we get a reflection coming off the light. The light happens to be an area light that is a disk. So what I can do is start to maybe manipulate the color here. We'll pick something fairly obnoxious, maybe something like that, and something fairly blue and fairly bright. You can see how it's affecting the entire jet. So all the shaders, the 10 shaders that we're controlling different faces across the body, are replaced with one shader. Then the diffuse roughness allows you to control essentially the surface texture. So when you increase the diffuse roughness, it's almost as if you're adding a roughness to the surface. So the diffuse roughness has really just to do with the color of the surface and the way color is scattered across the surface. We have a metalness slider that used to be a boolean on or off. Right now that's a slider between 0 and 1. Have it fully metal, render as a metal, or not, and set it to 0 or somewhere in between. The weight is just the effectiveness of this category. If you set it to 0, then there is no contribution from the base color. So that's kind of how the basics of that work, and then you can get into specular. You can modify you can set the roughness. You can see that we have a much rougher specular. Maybe you want to increase the intensity of that a bit and maybe change the color of that a bit. So yeah, it's kind of pretty self-explanatory. The IOR is essentially the intensity of the reflection. And then with the coat, I can crank that up, and you can see that we start to get that secondary reflection in there on top of the original specular. Let's go ahead and drop in a couple of presets. I might want to select something like a candy apple red, for example. So you get that very intense looking red car paint type color. We might want to use something like a Dakota brown here. That's an actual Mercedes color. An electric blue, maybe something like a two-tone. If we go in here, I have a couple of two-tone type shaders set up that will give you kind of a darker, less warm color green towards the areas that roll away from the camera. With that, let's swap out this light for, not swap it out, but essentially change the type. You can see that right now it's set to disk. And if I set it to quad, you can see that I get a very different highlight here. If I were to go in and turn off the ground mesh and then turn on the ground plane, and we'll go ahead and re-render that real quick. There it is. You can see the quad show up very clearly, and you can also see what kind of highlight that produces on the surface. So if I were to select that area light and open it up, we can then modify things like roundness, which is an Arnold 5 control. You can see that it starts to round off the corners. It'll slightly modify the specular as well. And we also have something called soft edge. So we want to go ahead and soften this up. We can just crank this up, and you can see that now you get a concentration of light and then have it really softly roll off to the corners. And in this case, obviously you can see it's also affecting the specular on the surface. So then I can go back to a disk, and you can see that we get this large disk. And if I increase the intensity here to something like 4, you can see then obviously we get something much brighter. Maybe set this back to, so I'm modifying the exposure in this case. You can also use color temperature, and if I use a color temperature of maybe like 44, that's just easy to type in. I get something fairly warm, or something like 99. That's obviously very cool, right? And so the default is somewhere around, I think it's 6500 or so. So I'm going to turn that off. and then maybe talk a little bit about spread as well. So in this case, we have a disk light, and by dropping the spread, we're starting to narrow the beam of the light. So essentially, a disk light with a spread of 1 will emit light in 180 degrees. By dropping this down to something that looks more like this, you're starting to focus this more like a spotlight. And if I go all the way to 0, we get something that is fairly circular and concentrated in one area. It also increases the apparent intensity, and it also changes the way it produces speculars on surfaces. The shading is affected by this as well, is what I'm saying. All right, so let's go back to a spread of 1 and an exposure of maybe 3. So with this, let's go ahead and tumble this around. You can see that from window, 3D manipulation is turned on. You can also go to toolbar icons and say show 3D manip icon, which is this icon right here. So if you turn it off, it treats it like a 2D image. If you turn it on, you're back into 3D manipulation, and you can of course do that from your camera view as well. We have toolbar icons here as well. Since we're at it, we can add the gamma icon. So we have exposure, the first one, gamma, the second one, with little reset switches that we can use to reset this back to where it was. We also have toolbar icons to show debug shading that help you analyze things like ambient occlusion or the wireframe or lighting intensity across your surfaces. So if I set this to basic shading, you can see what that looks like. These are very fast, and there are equivalent utilities to actually make it render this way in a sequence, not just having these presets here. So this is the lighting path, so you can see what the lighting intensities look like across the surface. Here's an occlusion render, a wireframe render. You get the idea. We can go to object IDs, basically showing you all the different objects in the scene. And the idea is that you can pick from this as well, right? Not just the object idea, but in any setting. So in here, I can go ahead and pick the body, or I can pick the canopy, or I can pick a piece like this engine cowling. So all these pieces can be picked from any of these passes. And then the last one is like an isolate select. So in this case, we get this little piece selected. I can go in here and just select the body. And you can see how it just renders the body in this case. So if we need an isolated example of what this looks like as a single object, we can do that. And you can add objects to this as well. And so if I wanted to look at the body, select the body. You wanted to look at the ground, so you can see the contour, the outline of the body, which is essentially treated as a black hole. Or we can select both. And you can see that I can just add what's selected to my render, and that's the only thing that it'll render. So with that, let's go back to the basic view, or I'm sorry, the shaded view, and continue on with this UI. So we have our list of cameras, so we can go to like a perspective view, or we can go to like a perspective 2, or back to our working camera. We also get our RG and B, as well as our luminance, and then back to our RGB. We get our 1:1, so if I resize this, it doesn't show you the render at 1:1. You can hit 1:1, it's back to the actual size of the image. And then of course we can expand the UI here to show some of the other controls that we have. So these three icons, the one on the right, the little gear icon, expands the UI. The first one stops IPR. Any edits will not update. There's no linkage between your 3D scene and IPR. If you do turn it on, so now IPR is active, and you can see that if I tumble, it does that. You can turn off temporarily scene updates. And so if you hold scene updates, you can make some edits real quick, and then if you refresh it, it'll refresh and render all your edits. So there's two tabs here, pixel and display. Let's talk about display. So there's gamma and exposure, just like you have in the top bar. And then we have the view transform, which is currently set to sRGB. That's the default. But you can go to raw. Let's go ahead and reset gamma and exposure. So you can see what the raw data looks like as opposed to a view transform that is sRGB. Now, if you wanted to, you can say something like, I want the view transform to be sRGB, but I want the actual output transform to be something like raw. If I go to color management, enable color management is turned on. You can, if you wanted to, under output color transform preferences, apply output color transform and then set this to something like raw. And so in this case, the output will be raw, right? If you set this to sRGB, then it would be the same as the view transform, or if you say use the true view transform, that too would be sRGB. You can also have these overrides, these rules that you create. You can create more rules. And so this is something that was added somewhere along the line of one of the 2017 releases. spaces as well. So for image extensions like .tx, you can have the input color space be something you specify as well. So in this case, I would want it to be raw. You can set it to raw there also. Let's switch into snapshots. We'll talk a little bit about snapshots. We have this vehicle at a certain color. I just created a snapshot. I might want to go in and actually use a folder to save all my snapshots. If I want to see them later or separate, I can do that. So what I want to do is in the working directory, you could see that I have Maya 2017 images, select snapshots, and say select folder. And so now that that's going to prompt me, do you want to copy the current snapshots to select the folder? Yes. And so as soon as it fills in that folder, all those snapshots and subsequent snapshots will be saved there. So in this case, I also would like to jump into my standard surface and maybe replace this with a different shader, like a different two-tone, and you can see how that renders. And I'm going to add that to the list, so we have 2 now. You can also go in and say set this as A and then set this as B, and then you get this sliding bar that can swipe across your vehicle to evaluate one shader versus another if you need to make decisions like this. Of course, from then on you can continue making snapshots however you like. I can go in and maybe just kind of move this around, turn this off. You can see that now it's starting to update again, and then we'll create another snapshot from this angle, and then maybe another one from this angle. And again, all these are saved inside of your images folder. And if I bring up RV, we can go through here and just kind of look at the different snapshots.